6 March 1944, Berlin, Brandenburg. The contrails run like torn chalk over a hard winter sky as the 8th Air Force bores in. Long-range Mustangs ride high and wide, thinned to singles and pairs, the way Lt Gen James Doolittle now wants them free to hunt. A flight from the 4th Fighter Group drops tanks, noses lift, and the engines bite clean air. Below the clouds, German day fighters knit into attack lines, the old script forming gather, climb, strike the boxes. The script tears. The Americans arrive before the climb is finished. 4P, 51 seconds cut across the ladder of BF 109 seconds and FW 190 seconds, a clean slash of speed and gunfire. Tracers stitch, a canopy bursts white, a fighter tumbles end over end through a frost-bright hole in the cloud deck. On the bomber frequency there is no cheer, only procedure. High cover engaged. Continue in. Ahead of the stream, a ket of me, 410 seconds, leans into its run-heavy noses meant to break the bomber boxes. They never reach them. The Mustangs meet them head-on, not to defend but to erase. One twin engine takes the full bite of 50 seconds along the cockpit seam and erupts orange against iron sky. Fuel mist hangs for a second, like breath in cold air. Parachutes open late. German radios crackle to scatter and reform. The Americans are already climbing again, sliding right to bar the next stare of fighters trying to reach the altitude where bombers live. Splash one twin, shift high right. Over Stendal, another detachment from the 357th catches, a fresh rise of interceptors, straining out of a cloud gate, and rips 3 away in under a minute. The air smells of hot oil and cordite. The only rhythm is identify, acquire, fire, extend. The bomber stream keeps its course for Berlin. The sky holds its breath. By the first quarter of 1944, the war over Western Europe tightens to a narrow window measured in fuel pilots and weeks. Germany still fields dense flak belts and quick-climbing day fighters around Berlin, yet the reserves that made 1943 survivable are thinning aviation. Gasoline is rationed. Replacement pilots arrive with fewer hours and every lost. Veteran takes irreplaceable knowledge with him. Across the Channel, the United States shifts its aim. After 2 brutal seasons for unescorted bomber streams, the 8th Air Force no longer treats escort as a shield chained to aluminum. Lt Gen James Doolittle gives a colder instruction: break the Luftwaffe first and the bombing will follow. Maj Gen William Kepner orchestrates the flow-phased escorts handed off in layers so Mustangs can run ahead, peel high and fall on German formations before those formations ever touch a combat box. That change makes the moment in the Berlin approaches matter far beyond a single kill. The German plan depends on ceremony and timing: gather under controllers, climb through numbered altitudes, shape into a hammerhead of Sturmgruppen W4 190A. For close-in attacks, while May 410 and BF 110 with heavy guns. Rip lanes through bombers. It works only if the interceptors are allowed to assemble. The American plan sets out to snap the ladder itself. Fighters from the 4th Fighter Group under Col Don Blakeslee and the 357th Fighter Group carry drop tanks deep and arrive early on the axis of climb, turning the Luftwaffe's riser into a kill zone where energy and order are still. Fragile. Both commands understand the stakes. For Germany, daylight shock is the last public proof of strength. A single heavy formation slashing a bomber wing still calms a home front, and soldiers on the ground who are promised that aces will keep American heavies away from the heartland. For the 8th Air Force, air mastery ahead of an invasion is arithmetic: shorten the campaign against oil and transport, make Normandy viable spare crews who would otherwise be fed to a calendar of losses through summer. If escorts fail to dislocate the defense in spring, the bombing offensive bleeds longer, Overlord inherits a sky with teeth, and Berlin keeps time to bargain. If escorts succeed now, the Luftwaffe's daylight presence shrinks from threat to reflex, and reflex is predictable. The memories of 1943 still press on every brief. Crews remember Schweinfurt Regensburg, the long legs home with gaps in protection, the way a single misstep in formation opened a row of B-17 seconds to disciplined attacks. Even with P-51 seconds available, no one imagines immunity. Weather can split cover flak corridors, can force predictable tracks, and a turning fight at the wrong altitude still wastes the escort's one advantage: speed held in reserve. The new standing orders therefore sound like factory procedure: do not orbit bombers, hunt forward in flights, strike during climb and assembly, do not be drawn into scissors, extend reform, and repeat. After bombs away, if fuel permits, go to the airfields and rails that feed tomorrow's interceptors. Across the Berlin Belt, the Reich's day fighter system under Adolf Galland strains to answer. The ground network can vector and flak can thicken the sky, but fuel allocations, throttle training, and scramble reach. Veteran Staffeln are spliced with novices. Heavy fighters promise shock value, yet are big targets during climb, and the very Sturm tactics that once chewed through gaps now require a clean approach that escorts are dedicated to deny. This is why the scene over Brandenburg counts as more than a clean slash of tracers. It is a test of doctrine under the narrowest conditions: winter light fixed routes to the capital, both sides carrying plans that cannot share the same air. The bomber stream keeps its line for Berlin. The escorts rush the ladder, not the box. The German formations try to finish their gather under a sky already disturbed. For a few minutes at the rim, everything balances, and then the scale moves. The German way of killing bombers in early 1944 is not a myth, it is a practiced machine. Controllers build the intercept in layers. BF 109 seconds and Fw 190 seconds form lines to make head-on passes that split a formation and force defensive turns. Behind them, Fw 190 Sturmgruppen train to sit almost inside the B-17's wake and rake tail guns at knife range, where a second of fire can peel a stabilizer or set self-sealing tanks alight. Off one flank, the heavy twins, Me 410 seconds and BF 110 seconds, with long barrel cannon farm kills by cutting lanes through the boxes. It is choreography built on nerve and timing, and it has worked when escorts are thin or chained too tight to the heavies to interfere early. The weakness is the climb. Every plan requires a quiet ladder assemble, take the controller's vector, trade fuel for altitude, meet at a gate, then fall on the stream. That ladder is fragile. At low energy, spacing is loose, radios are busy, formations are half-formed, and the heavy twins are still slow in turns. A few minutes of harassment here do not just cost aircraft, they spill the timing that makes storm attacks lethal. Every escort pilot smart enough to read the pattern knows where to stand with a full tank and altitude in hand. The American answer is procedure, not swagger. The escort is no longer an umbrella, it is a conveyor belt. Flights are pushed forward in phases with clear altitude, gates, and fuel tables. High cover owns the top of the assembly ladder. Middle cover floats a step inside the bomber stream's nose. Low elements guard the exit routes and pounce on anything that slips down through flak and weather. A forward flight arrives, 20 to 50 miles ahead of the lead combat box, looks for the vertical riser of contrails, and black specks threading up through holes in cloud and dives once. The pass is a straight slash guns on for a heartbeat, then climb, extend, and reform. No one stays to turn. That would surrender the single advantage that matters at altitude: stored energy. In a cockpit, the difference between brochure numbers and survival is the first steady sight picture. At 300 miles per hour and 8,000 feet below freezing, a gun camera is an honesty test. A Mustang coming down from high right gains the sight first. The German formation, still knitting upward, must defend while starved of speed and angles. A heavy twin that is beautiful at gunnery range is clumsy here, forced to roll and pitch with tanks full and engines labouring at climb settings. The escort pilot's check is short drop tanks if needed, confirm closure burst and break nose up, count seconds to rejoin his wingman and scan again. The radio stays clipped and dry because the drill is more important than the story. Big Week offers the first proof under sustained pressure. In late February, the escort conveyor keeps arriving at the riser before the hammer forms. German units that have rehearsed head-on lanes find themselves reset by dives from above their left shoulder. Sturm elements start late or arrive scattered. Bombers still take losses, and no one in the stream mistakes this for safety. But the rhythm changes. The close-in chew that used to develop over minutes now fails to appear at all. Reports read like machine notes: disrupted assembly, premature jettisons, partial attacks broken by high cover. The heavies deliver their loads through flak corridors that were meant to trap them for the finishing wave, and that finishing wave keeps missing its cue. On the Berlin approaches in early March, the pattern hardens into habit. The forward elements from groups trained on the new directive run well ahead and look for the climb. They do not defend the formation. They attack the idea of the formation, erase the ladder so the rest collapses. When a detachment catches a riser over Brandenburg, the first pass takes a leader out of the sequence and the second splits a ket trying to dress for a head-on line. 2 minutes of violence in the wrong place for the defender ruin 10 minutes of choreography. A dozen pilots who expected to hit a combat box now find themselves in singles and pairs heads on a swivel, burning fuel they wanted for the fight, and diving through flak to escape. The bomber crews feel it as an absence: fewer coordinated head-ons, fewer stern runs that force a box to scatter, more isolated dives that defensive gunners can track and punish. Translating specifications into the body is the point. Armor thickness, gun caliber, boost pressure, all of it cashes out as whether a crew gets a steady picture before the other side does. At the heights where contrails smear like chalk, a slash attack at high relative energy makes that first picture. A turning duel at medium altitude throws it away. That is why the orders read like factory rules. Do not orbit the box. Do not accept scissors with a single that wants you slow. Do not chase a damaged fighter down through cloud when the next riser is forming above you. If the pass blows the ladder apart, climb and make another. If the fuel margins still hold after bombs away, carry the same logic to the airfields and rails that feed tomorrow's ladder. German crews are not fools. They know when the script tilts. A controller can still vector. Flak can still blacken the sky. Experienced elements can still land a hard punch when weather gifts a clean approach. But the basic economy is shifting. Every minute burned assembling under a sky seeded with free-hunting escorts is a minute closer to fuel warnings and a minute further from the gates where their tactics bite. The heavy fighters promise shock only if the road is open. The escorts are now paid to park trucks across that road. Novice pilots who needed calm climbs to find their marks are suddenly learning how to survive being bounced before they learn how to make a tail attack. Veterans who could once choose the terms of the fight are meeting enemies at the wrong point on the energy curve. A second example seals the lesson. When another forward flight reaches the next riser west of the stream, they repeat the geometry: top-down pass, short burst, vertical recovery. The German formation never becomes a formation. The bomber crews hold course through the flak belts, counting the passes that do come isolated, late, hurried, and talking themselves back to the calm of checklists. The escorts swap stations on time with fuel cross-checks and altitudes in clean blocks. The system looks impersonal because it is supposed to be. Procedure eats drama, and drama is what head-on lines require to work. The conclusion is not a slogan but a mechanical truth. When the fight occurs where the defender is still assembling, the old German killing method loses the conditions it needs. When the escort treats every pass as a timed step on a belt, identify, acquire fire, extend the odds move, 1 day's result could be luck, 2 days' result could be weather. Week after week at the same gates and the same heights, the outcomes start to look like a diagram instead of a story. This is not an accident. This is repeatable. Frost hangs in the cockpit seal, and the breath inside the mask tastes of rubber. The climb needle sits where the briefing said it should, just under the gate. The controller called in the last vector. ABF 109 on the left drops his wingtip to hold position, and the leader taps 2 fingers on the canopy rail. Steady, steady, keep the ladder clean. Below the deck of cloud, Berlin lies out of sight, but the flak belts and the contrails smeared high mark the road the Americans must take. The radio from ground control is crisp at first, then busy, then brittle. A new voice cuts the net change, heading 5, climb 2, then another overlaps it with an acknowledgement drowned by a cough of static. The leader rechecks fuel and mixture, slides his gloved thumb over the gun heaters, and names the alt gate to himself like a prayer. The body knows this rhythm: gather, climb, dress for a head-on lane, hit the box, hard dive through cloud reform. The rhythm breaks before the gate. A pale line slides across the top of the canopy, not a bomber stream but a scratch of speed and altitude, travelling the wrong way for a formation. The wingman squeezes his eyes to clear the fog on the edges and sees the line split into 4 faint fireflies of sunlight on prop arcs high right to low left. A warning goes out on the net height right, and 3 aircraft in the Ket tighten without instruction. The leader checks his horizon bar, holds a touch more rudder to keep the nose true, and feels the shiver that comes when the airframe crosses a pocket of colder air. He wants his sight to steady, wants the world to slow to the known drill, see the box, run the line, hold fire at a distance that feels like touching. Instead, the sky arrives in a tear. The contrails of the strangers dive, the sound of wind thickens, and a burst of white sparks flicks against a canopy 2 positions to his right. The fighter there jerks no tumbles, one wing gone light as if someone cut a string. On the American side, the decision took less than a sentence. The flight lead from the 4th Fighter Group saw the ladder as a stack of dark beads lifting through thin cloud, and said it the way the training said it: drop tanks, push 46 in from high right, tanks fall, and the airplane shivers lighter. The gun sight glass has a smear on the edge he has stopped seeing. The only geometry that matters is closure rate, and the angle that holds a 1-second burst on the leader of a half-formed 3-ship. His wingman calls tally and slides half a wingspan out on the far side. The leader presses the trigger, and the nose tugs a hair to the left as the guns chew, and then he is already easing aft, stick to trade speed back for height. He does not look for the result. There is a sound like a shovel tossed into a sheet metal shed and an orange tongue on the right edge of his vision, but the habit is to pull, to extend, to stay too fast to turn with anyone. In the German cockpit, the mask air tastes suddenly of hot rubber as the pilot grunts against the roll to clear the streak that just cut past his canopy. His sight never settled. The box is still only an idea somewhere ahead, and now the choreography is off. The first instinct is to swear and press on. The second is to check the leader. The leader's machine is smoking, dropping a slow arc through the cloud gap with pieces sloughing away. The radio cracks and hisses with half-call signs and a clipped order that might be to scatter or might be to hold. The pilot feels the stick lighten in his palm as he noses over to find speed to be small against a sky he cannot control anymore. He glances for flak bursts, for a black pole that means a belt he can dive toward. On the American frequency, the words are spare, splash 1, shift high right, cover the next riser. The leader's eyes never stop moving left, quarter high, right quarter low, 6 o'clock. He sees the twin-engine shape in the climb, fat-nosed, and determined 3,000 feet below the altitude where bombers live. Heavy fighters are trouble to bombers. They are gifts to a high cover with speed to spend. He and his wingman bend the nose again with the slightest forward pressure, let the airplane slip down that one gear it loves, and the sight walks across the heavy's spinner. The burst is 1 second and a breath. A seam opens along the cockpit glazing, and a wash of fuel ghosts into the wake like breath in winter. It is all angles and timing. The pilot feels the harness bite, and then relax as he noses up again to where the air is thinner and safer. Farther west over Stendal, a detachment from the 357th lifts out of a patch of cloud and reads the air the same way. The sky is a thesis now, not a mystery. The riser is a vertical stair made of black specks, each one carrying too little speed for the kind of defense you can fly with pride. The leader of the detachment points with words that he keeps short. 2 go for the top step, 2 for the one below. Guns check distance closes, and then the same, taut rhythm press fire climb becomes the only music in the world. One German swings late and presents his belly. The wingman checks down a hair to keep the sight from sliding off and lets the burst thump through the engine cowl. The canopy bursts white as it frosts from inside, and a shape tumbles, pieces flashing like mica in sun. Back on the bomber route, the crews feel it as the absence of a cornered animal. There are head-on charges, but they are late and light, and the tail gunners are not screaming for whole minutes at a time. The stream holds its line. Flak starts its steady punctuation, and the navigators watch the drift compared to briefed wind and know the city is where it should be. None of that is comfort. It is simply the narrow way the day must go to fit the plan that was written into the escort orders. The German pilot who dove away through the first break finds cloud and then sunlight again and then cloud. He levels for a beat and checks instruments as if the panel can bless him with a new kind of day. The radio gives him a heading, and he climbs into it because that is what the system needs from him. He knows the drill for head-on lanes by feel. He knows the tail attack by the thump in the stomach when he slides up under the bomber's wash. He does not know the right answer for being hit before those moves exist. The fuel gauge is not a number he trusts anymore. He clicks the mic and says the word that is half request, half confession: abort. He does not know if anyone hears. The Mustang crew has no words to spare for the men they just knocked sideways. The lead makes a quick fuel check in hours and minutes and assigns his flight a new alt block. A new ladder is forming to the south, and he wants to be at the hinge in time. He tells his wingman to hold the 5-second spacing on the next dive. Too close, and you eat the other man's wake. Too far, and you do not support. The body has learned a different rhythm from last year's escort work. There is no orbit at the bomber's wingtip, no circle fought in sympathy with an attack that wants you slow. There is only the belt-forward element attacks, climbs, reforms. The next element takes its place. After the bomb release, if the tanks and the tables allow, the belt runs again across airfields and rails. A third knot of German fighters rises out of a ragged hole in the cloud deck. One peels at the sight of contrails cutting across and dives to a belt of flak that looks like safety. The others try to hold the climb long enough to become a formation. The airframe speaks with small shakes and noises the pilot knows from training, but the sight never steadies, and he is tempted beyond reason to turn inside the contrail that just slashed by to prove that the old knife can still cut. The impulse is wrong at this altitude, in this machine, in this hour. He tilts, and the nose heavy with climb power does not bite. The elevator loads, and the airplane gives him the blunt feeling that says no. A shadow crosses his canopy, the sky flashes white with glare, and the sound of guns reaches him like gravel hitting a tin roof. He forces the nose down and the blood climbs into his forehead as the G unloads. He is not hunting now. He is leaving. The American flight hears the satisfaction of timing more than the idea of victory. The bomber stream is somewhere to the north, a moving line they are paid not to touch. The leader watches contrails and sun angles and counts seconds on the clock that lives in his head. He checks the mirror and sees his wingman where he should be. He checks the corners and sees nothing too close. He calls a turn to the next gate and feels the airplane's small relief as the prop settles in the climb. The flak bursts between him and the horizon are just punctuation, and he wants to stay at the line where punctuation is rare. He thinks about fuel, because fuel is what lets a doctrine exist longer than a paragraph. At the edge of the zone, a voice on the German net Karma now sets a new rendezvous. The pilot who escaped through the flak cannot decide if he should answer. He looks at his hands. They are steady again on the stick and the throttle. He looks at the sky and sees only shapes he does not trust. He pulls around into the new heading and watches the alt needle creep. He says nothing. He thinks about how many minutes remain before the warning light, and he knows without wanting to say it that minutes are the new measure of what is possible. Over Stendal, the 357th finishes the second pass, and the leader calls rejoin. He keeps the language dry, because dry words are the rope that keeps a flight together. They had come down like a blade through a paper ladder, and now they pull back to the height the plan tells them to hold. The wingman looks once at the plume of a fighter that went in, and then, as he was taught, he looks away. The bomber stream goes on, and the city under cloud and smoke waits for the part of the day that has nothing to do with fighters. In the climb air, the doctrine feels simple. In the body, identify, acquire, fire, extend. On the other side, the doctrine feels like something lost that used to be obvious. Gather, climb, hit as one. The sky between them is not a place for speeches or memories. It is a place where procedures decide who breathes hard and who counts seconds to the next gate. The American leader glances once at his fuel figures and chooses not to promise himself a strafing run after bombs away. The belt must keep running, and there will be other days. He calls the shift to the high right, the words clipped like cuts in a film. The German pilot hears only the flicker of his own engine in the headset and the thrum in the airframe that says, "You are climbing, you may yet get where you said you were going." The day does not give him that. The day gives him a sky where the kill happens before the story begins, and in that sky, the only hero is a checklist. The change begins as a sentence on a briefing board and becomes the way an air force breathes. Lt Gen James Doolittle tells the 8th Air Force that the first job of escort is no longer to hover near aluminum. The first job is to break the Luftwaffe. Maj Gen William Kepner translates that order into clocks, altitudes, and fuel tables that flight leads can hold in their heads while frost blooms on the canopy. What had been a defensive chore turns into a timed offensive. Forward elements of P-51 seconds run 20 to 50 miles ahead of the lead combat box, kill the intercept while it is still a ladder of fragile climbs, and hand the job to the next element on schedule. The words are plain, the tone is dry, and the promise is colder than any hymn. If we make this a procedure, losses stop being a weather report and start being something we choose. The pipe that carries an idea from a commander's mouth to a pilot's hands is short in early 1944 because people cut it that way. After-action reports at 8th Fighter Command are stripped of story and boiled to technique, where the first sight picture stabilized, how long bursts ran, which altitude gate produced the bounce, how often head-on lanes arrived late, when high cover owned the top of the climb. Tactics, techniques, and procedures are printed into one-page cards that sit under grease pencils and map clips. Debriefs run on gun camera film fuel states and timing errors. The next morning's fragmentary orders choose blocks of sky, not heroics. High cover will own the stair at specific minutes. Mid-cover will surf the stream's nose. Low cover will deny the exits. You can hear the factory in the verbs own, surf, deny. You can feel the production line in the rhythm, arrive, cut, climb, reform. Industrial muscle lets that rhythm become a habit instead of a gamble. Merlin-powered P-51 seconds with 75 or 108-gallon drop tanks roll out of depots and forward maintenance sites with the kind of predictability that makes risk cheap. Engines swap without weeks in a shed. Cannibalization is a controlled practice, not a sign of collapse. A bent panel, a tired plug, a scarred tire, there are bins for that. The turnaround on a healthy airframe is measured in hours, not a season. Pilots feed the line at the same pace. Training hours are enough to make the energy fight a reflex rather than a guess, and replacement pools are big enough that a squadron commander can accept the losses that offensive escort inevitably takes without dismantling his unit's competence. The radio net and ground control picture are good enough that time on station and handoffs look like a timetable, not a prayer. Because the machinery runs, the doctrine can be strict. Flights are briefed to hunt forward of the bombers, not circle them. High elements keep a reserve of altitude like a bank account. Mid-elements float just far enough ahead to catch the first German that slips past the top slash. Low elements are the trapdoor for anything that tries to dive through flak to safety. The pass itself is standard drop tanks, if the calculation says to a 1-second burst when the sight picture is honest, a vertical extension that denies the temptation to turn with anyone. No one is paid to win a duel. Everyone is paid to remove the conditions under which the enemy's plan works. The other side brings plans that once worked because the Americans let them. Adolf Galland's day fighter defense relies on choreography. Controllers build an intercept, assemble under cloud climb on a ladder, with numbered steps aligned for head-on lanes with BF 109 seconds and FW 190 seconds, throw Sturmgruppen FW 190A into the bomber stream's soft places at knife range, and let me 410 seconds and BF 110 seconds with heavy cannon quarry from the flanks. It is theatre that depends on timing. It is murder that depends on being allowed to form. The spring of 1944 removes the stage. It is not that German crews forget how to hit. It is that the window for hitting closes before the first cue. Fuel breaks the script from the bottom up. Synthetic output is under attack, and rationing starves training before it starves combat. Pilots who should have learned to hold energy at height are sent to fight while still clumsy at the one thing a high-altitude war demands. Squadron leaders who wore their experience like armor are killed or transferred and cannot be replaced on any meaningful timeline. Hours in the logbook fall average quality slips. Cohesion is patched with men who know the checklist but not the feel. Heavy twins, magnificent as gun platforms, are liabilities in the climb where the war is now fought. Sturm tactics that require a clean approach die when one bounce arrives 5 minutes early. Controllers are good, Radar nets are clever, flak belts are thick, and still the rising stair is a place. Escorts are paid to ruin every hour, every mission, as if punching a clock. Big Week turns from a name into a method. Late February is a lab under fire. When the escorts run the belt correctly, German head-on lanes show up late or fractured. Reports from bomber groups stop describing long, continuous tail attacks and start describing spasms. The difference is not dramatic, it is procedural. You can read it in the way crews talk about their minutes. There are still losses, but the surge that once came in 8-minute waves now shatters into stray passes that defensive guns can punish. When an attack does arrive in force, the debriefs map the failure backward to a handoff missed or a fuel table broken by weather. The fix enters the next day's card. The machine trims itself. The Berlin missions in early March are where the curve bends visibly. A 4th Fighter Group element under Col Don Blakeslee's umbrella and a 357th Fighter Group detachment ahead of the stream do exactly what the doctrine says. They do not wait at the box. They find the climb. They choose leaders and half-formed 3 ships. They fire once and climb out. They trade speed, not pride, and the German formations lose the one thing they needed: time. 10 minutes of orchestra rehearsal vanish into 90 seconds of slammed doors. BF 109 seconds that should have been a head-on hammer find themselves in singles and pairs. Me 410 seconds that should have sprayed long lanes of cannon fire are instead nose-high fat with fuel trying to roll while shocked by the first slash. The Sturm elements that needed a smooth approach are scattered and late. What happens inside the American organization in the days around those missions is as important as what happens in the sky. The gun camera films show when bursts are too long, when sights are snatched, when wingmen lose the spacing that keeps a pair lethal without creating a mid-air. The fuel math is enforced. There is no glory in a strafing run that strands an element in weather with dry tanks. After-action notes call out the traps that turned pilots slow and low, and those traps are written into the negative space of the next order do not be drawn. A patrol's success is not an anecdote. It is a template. A patrol's failure is not a grievance, it is a parameter. That discipline is what allows command to say without bluster that what worked Tuesday can be made to work Thursday. Industry makes the promise credible. Airframes that take damage are not headstones for capability. They are tickets in a system built to return machines to service. Depot ships and English airfields act like branches of the same factory. A cracked radiator, a bent panel, a tired prop governor. Those are problems with part numbers and routing codes. A squadron that loses 3 Mustangs can still put up 4 flights the next day because spares exist and mechanics have checklists as ruthless as any pilots. The hardness of the supply chain is what lets a commander be hard about risk. A doctrine that spends airplanes to spend an enemy's time is only moral if new airplanes will appear tomorrow. In this theatre, in this quarter, they do. The Luftwaffe's constraints are not moral. They are physical. Fuel squeezes, training first, then operations. Serviceability sinks because spares are short and dispersal across rough fields trades safety from bombs for punishment to machines. The command network has intelligence and talent, but not elasticity. A radar plot can call a vector. It cannot conjure more minutes. When interceptors must be husbanded like museum pieces, tactics grow cautious. When aces are irreplaceable, the decision to commit becomes rarer, and rarity is another word for predictability. A defense that once claimed violence by surprise begins to show up on a schedule the enemy can write against. Doctrine reaches past the immediate fight to tomorrow's. Post-strike strafing, if fuel permits, is not bloodlust. It is logic. The same escort belt that shredded the ladder on the way in flips its direction on the way out and runs the line of airfields and rail spurs that feed the next day's ladder. A damaged hangar here, a ruined fuel truck there, a train burned on a siding. None of these are decisive by themselves, but they push a brittle system closer to the edge. Pilots flying home with enough in the tanks to spend a minute at low level know the rule: 1 pass, 1 target out. The point is not heroics. The point is erosion that a spreadsheet can see. This is why the American side can keep the doctrine cold. It does not require exceptional men on exceptional days. It requires men good enough to execute a checklist and a machine good enough to afford their mistakes while they learn. Crews are told that their job is not to make a story, it is to make a pattern. If high cover arrives over the riser within a window measured in tens of seconds, if bursts are kept to a second, if extensions are vertical rather than lateral, if handoffs hit the clock, then the Luftwaffe's plan collapses before it starts. That is not a claim about national virtue. It is a claim about queuing theory in a sky where time is scarce. German officers know it. They write it down later in terms that sound like engineering. We could not outclimb them anymore. We lacked the fuel to train replacements to the standard the fight required. We needed ordered mass and met escorted singles. The attempt to answer with heavier guns and thicker plates on Sturm airframes acknowledges the truth while trying to bully it. Heavier and thicker help only if the approach is clean. The escorts have been paid to make sure it is not. A heavier airplane needs more time to reach the height where it is terrifying. Time is the one currency the doctrine targets. 2 vignettes capture the machine's edge. In Big Week, a relay of escorts intercepts 3 separate German climbs before noon. None of the bounces are cinematic. Each is a shallow cut across a riser, a burst, a climb. The reports read like ledgers. 2 formations disrupted. 1 aborted combat box, penetrated only by stragglers. Days later, on 6 of March, the Berlin belt sees the same geometry applied with the same dryness. A meaty ket of heavy fighters never makes its run. 2 P-51 seconds pull a nose low / the leader eats a Simov. 50 seconds, and the survivors dive for flak instead of courage. A second American pair cuts the next stair, and the pattern repeats. The bomber stream records head-ons as late and light. It is not a miracle. It is a Gantt chart written in contrails. Everything about the American method sounds impersonal, because that is its defense against luck. A single brilliant pilot can be killed by a single error. A single brilliant idea can be ruined by weather. A system that tolerates average men, executing average passes correctly every day at scale, will survive both. The virtue here is not romance, it is repeatability. The vice on the other side is not cowardice, it is scarcity. Scarcity makes organizations brittle. Brittle systems cannot absorb bad minutes. Bad minutes are what the Escort Doctrine manufactures on demand. What begins as a sentence on a board becomes the air that crews breathe, because the chain from board to throttle is short, and the factory behind it is long. The result in March 1944 is not that the Luftwaffe forgets how to fight, nor that American fighters become magical. The result is that one side can choose the time and place where its plan has an advantage over and over faster than the other side can adapt. That is what doctrine means when it is more than a speech. That is what logistics mean when they are more than numbers. That is what industrial confidence buys the right to take chances until a chance becomes a rule. Procedure erodes myth. When escort runs like an assembly line, the Luftwaffe has no time left to form the blow. The myth had 3 faces, and each required the same condition to live time. Time to gather under cloud with the controller's headings. Time to climb the ladder in clean steps. Time to shape the attack into the angles that once split bomber boxes and left aluminum falling in rows. Head-on lanes with BF 109 seconds and Fw 190 seconds depended on arriving as a saw-toothed wall at the exact minute a combat box crossed a belt of flak. Sturmgruppen full 190A with armor and extra guns depended on sliding into tail cones at knife distance, where a second of fire tore stabilizers and set self-sealing tanks burning. Heavy twins, Me 410 seconds and BF 110 seconds depended on reaching the bomber altitude with enough energy left to rake lengthwise through a box. The promise was that aces and doctrine together would always make the approach. The spring of 1944 took away the minutes those promises drank. The first break in the pattern is not an explosion. It is a late arrival. A head-on lane that once formed on a controller's queue now materializes 2 minutes after the stream has passed the point where it could be trapped. 2 minutes is nothing on a map, and everything in a sky run by clocks. The pilots feel it before anyone writes it down. They hear their own breathing in the mask while the altimeter crawls, and they know they are climbing toward a fight that used to wait for them and no longer does. What blocks them is not a wall of escorts sitting by the bombers. It is a blade of escort 20 to 50 miles ahead of the stream, arriving at the top of the ladder early enough to force scattered roll-offs, steep defensive dives and rejoins that never quite dress. The old show requires an orchestra. The new reality feeds the musicians through different doors. The Sturm idea dies next, and it dies with sound. Tail attack squadrons that built their identity on close-in courage discover that courage cannot compress distance when the approach itself is broken. The climb takes longer because tankers guard fuel, because weather gates are wrong by a shade, because the first bounce dislocates the lead element and inserts panic where ritual used to sit. Sturm kites reach the stream not as a block, but as singles and pairs. A single W-190A with armour is heavy without being inevitable. It must cross defensive arcs alone without the blanket of comrades that made gunners choose wrong targets. Its pass is short, late and punished. You can hear the new vocabulary on the radio, not the roll call of a massed run, but the clipped word that means abandon the attack. Abbrechen. The heavy twin fantasy survives longest because it houses the most steel. 410 seconds look like answers in photographs and statistics. Their noses are full of gun and their wings carry the range to pace a stream. But the place where war now decides winners is the climb. A heavy twin in climb is a promise, not a weapon. The escorts are paid to kill promises. A top-down slash on a leader forces a break in the one formation that can protect a twin during the crucial minute before it levels. A seam of 50 calories along the canopy rail turns a cannon ship into smoke before it fires a round. Those that survive the first slash pull for flak belts try to roll into safety and discover that safety is a slower climb than their doctrine needs. They are most dangerous when the stream is right there in front of them. The escorts push the window shut just before right there happens. The German system notices and tightens the screws. Controllers urge earlier scrambles. Flights push to the gate with oxygen biting and gauges accusing. Veterans try to lead from a place that used to be comfort and now feels like a narrowing corridor. But fuel is the language of 1,944, and fuel speaks denial. Training hours have already been clipped. Replacement pilots arrive with the wrong reflex at altitude. They turn where they should extend. They chase where they should climb. They carry too much wing waggle into a sky that demands steadiness. Aces can correct within their own cockpits, but aces cannot correct an organization's minutes. When the first bounce strikes the top step and shakes the ladder, the difference between a brilliant pilot and a merely good one shrinks to the size of a checklist. Checklists cannot be shared across radios in the 3 seconds that matter. The American side does not crow. It audits. Gun camera film shows which passes bled too long, which bursts were vanity, which vertical extensions were too shallow, and invited a turning fight below cloud. Those failures become lines on cards. Handoffs between high and mid elements that slipped half a minute in weather become the subject of fuel tables and new headings. The next morning repeats the same plan with a minor correction, and the plan works better because the plan is a process, and processes learn. Doctrine stops being an idea and becomes the habit of a machine. Identify, acquire, fire, extend. Wave after wave, day after day, the escorts do not guard so much as erase. They erase the climb, and without the climb, the old German killing grammar cannot form sentences. On the Berlin belt, the collapse looks like absence. Bomber crews mark fewer long head-on sequences. Tail gunners report bursts of attacks that fail to develop into the sustained maul they dreaded in 1943. Navigator logs show times over flak belts without the expected knots of burning aircraft that used to track the finishing wave. The stream still bleeds because no doctrine erases danger, but it bleeds from pinpricks instead of from a saw. A mission debrief that once ran like an obituary now runs like a maintenance report, a head-on that was late, a pair of heavy twins that did not level in time, a group of W-190 seconds that arrived in chaff and were swatted away. Pilots on the German side begin to fly in a new posture, and posture is confession. Climb attitudes tilt into caution. Flight leaders accept gaps to reach a flak corridor intact rather than press a broken approach toward a stream that will not wait. The skill to make a head-on run remains in wrists and eyes, but the confidence that the run will be supported evaporates. The word Abbrechen enters the day earlier, not as cowardice, but as arithmetic. Without the minutes an attack needs, pressing an attack is theology. The Luftwaffe is not losing will, it is losing the conditions in which will cashes out. The administrative language hardens alongside the cockpit language. After-action notes from German formations emphasize assembly, broken by early engagement altitude shortfalls against mission timing and a shortage of fuel margin to reform after a defensive dive. The tone is technical, not theatrical. It does not say they were invincible. It says, "We did not reach the point in space and time where our tactics bite." In a cold sentence that sounds like engineering, the officers concede that the Americans now show up where the plan is weakest rather than where it is strongest. The old desire to add guns and plates to Sturm airframes answers the wrong question. Heavier frames help only when a formation approaches cleanly. Clean approaches require time. The escorts are in the business of stealing time. 2 brief collisions seen without music make the collapse felt. In late February, during Big Week, a German group climbs through a scattered cloud deck toward a controller's line. High cover arrives 8 minutes early on the top step and carves away the leaders with 1-second bursts. The rest scatter down through flak reform late and find that the head-on gate is already behind them. The stream passes with damage, not with ruin. A day or two later, an attempt to push Sturm into tail cones loses its dress when mid-cover flights clip the escorting 109 seconds away from their shepherd role. The armoured Fw 192 has arrived. As muscle without a skeleton, they are brave and solitary and dead. On 6 of March, in the Brandenburg approaches the same geometry, repeats in harder light. A ket of Me 410 seconds leans in toward a trough between flak bursts, noses heavy with guns, the perfect image of box breakers in a manual. The forward Mustangs do not argue with the image, they cancel the preface. One pair slashes from high right and writes a seam of 50 across the leader. The ket swivels, loses coherence, and then chooses to dive rather than press. A second American pair cuts the next riser of singles, who expected to dress into the head-on lane and instead meet the pass in the wrong direction. The bomber stream logs the head-on as late and light. The heavy twins that wanted to be decisive become context smoke markers against which other men wage the rest of the fight. The effect is behavioral before it is statistical. German pilots who once expected to hunt now expect to survive. They fly toward flak, because flak is a promise that escorts will not follow too low while still heavy with fuel. They accept the frustration of seeing a stream pass unmolested in order to keep their staffel on the board for the next call. When the massed run cannot be made, the day becomes a search for scraps that can be taken without being bounced. The airframe remains lethal in the right place. The doctrine stops providing the right place. American pilots, for their part, become more machine than story. They speak in altitudes, headings, minutes, and fuel states. A good day is not the one with the most victories. It is the one with the fewest broken handoffs and the cleanest vertical separations between elements. The satisfaction that matters is a bomber debrief that reads like an implementation check: high cover on time, mid-cover on time, exits denied, post-strike strafing executed within fuel limits. When the question of heroism arises at all, it is held private and brief because the organization cannot afford heroes who refuse to fit clocks. The collapse is not total because nothing in war is. Weather gifts, chances. Flak breaks formation. A brilliant German pilot finds a seam and tears a length of aluminum out of the sky in a run as fine as any in 1943. But these moments do not add back into a myth. They stand alone. The day belongs to the escort belt that manufactures bad minutes for the defender, at the one place a defender cannot spend them the top of the climb. The Luftwaffe's daylight presence around strategic targets pulls inward not by decree but by inertia. Fewer groups risk the long climb to the stream without escorting conditions they trust. More emphasis drifts toward night, toward flak, toward anything that does not require the one commodity, no order, can produce time to assemble. If you listen for a single sentence to capture the turn, it will sound like this, and it will not be shouted, "We do not make the climb in time." That is not despair. It is a scheduler's judgment. It is the sentence that ends a doctrine. The rest of the paperwork follows. Maintenance officers ask for parts that will not arrive. Training officers request hours they cannot give. Operations officers write routes that bend around the truth. Commanders who once burned their names into the story of daylight defense start to fret over survival curves for their remaining veterans. On the other side, the documents are as unemotional as the passes that produced them. Awards are given for missions executed exactly on plan, not for improvisations that survived chaos. The 357th is praised not for sudden courage but for clockwork applied to high sky. The 4th is cited for being where they were supposed to be when the minutes demanded it. The lesson chosen for teaching is not the flash of victory, but the removal of the opportunity for the enemy's plan to exist. The city under the bomber stream does not care which sentence wins. It receives bombs either way. The collapse we speak of happens a dozen miles and a dozen minutes before the city matters. It happens where contrails make chalk lines, and where a man with a mask on his face and gloves on his hands listens to his own breath and decides whether to trust a ritual invented last year or a reality written this morning. Enough men make the second choice, and the ritual becomes a memory. It is not that the Luftwaffe forgets how to be frightening. It is that fright must be delivered in formation on time, and the Escort Doctrine erases the appointment. After these days, the daylight myth changes shape. The word that held it together always falls out. Head-on lanes are no longer always there. Sturm wedges are no longer always in the tail cones. Heavy twins are no longer always carving lanes through the middle of a box. Sometimes these things happen. Often they do not. The difference between always and often is the difference between terror and risk. Risk can be budgeted. Risk can be borne. Risk can be written into a schedule with reserves. What remains to say fits into one line because one line is all a myth needs to die. After the Berlin approaches in March 1944, the finishing wave stopped arriving. What filled the sky instead were hurried exits before the escorts reached the next gate. In the days after the Berlin approaches, the change shows up first as silence, where a finishing wave used to be. Bomber debriefs replace pages of head-on timings with a line that reads late and light. Tail gunners talk about single dives punished by disciplined fire rather than the 8-minute maul they feared in 1943. The escort belt runs on the clock. High cover owns the riser. Mid-cover rides the nose. Low cover denies the exits, and the stream goes through the flak corridor without the ritual that once cut it open. Gun camera reels and after-action notes are turned into teaching sheets. Crews memorize minutes instead of anecdotes. The order set hardens. Hunt forward, 1 second, burst vertical, extend no turning, fights post-strike, strafing only if the fuel table says yes. The satisfaction that matters is procedural. A mission is good when handoffs are clean and altitudes hold. Across the lines, the posture of the defense tilts. More calls to abort arrive earlier in the hour. Leaders choose flak and weather as shields rather than insist on a broken approach. Mast runs thin out. Daylight confidence contracts around a few gift weather days. Losses of veterans bite into cohesion, and replacements carry too few hours to assert control at height. The net effect is not magic bombers still fall, but the tempo of organized blows becomes an exception, not a rule. By spring's end, the daylight air over strategic targets has narrowed. The oil campaign gains rhythm. The timetable for an invasion feels less like a bet. The lesson that lingers is not about a single duel, but about time as a weapon. If escorts can steal the minutes, a formation needs to become a blade, the blade never forms. What if those minutes had been stolen 6 months earlier? Would the black days of late 1943 have looked different? Next, we follow the belt to the deck and ask why German ground units started to fear a diving thunderbolt more than any. Zieren.